seconds later. So I think we are officially live now. Yay! So I got to post the live tweet. Don't say anything incriminating because people are watching. All right, posting live tweet. There it goes. Boom. Things just happen. All right. Thanks, Nicholas Widart on Twitter for promoting another episode of the PHP Roundtable. Let's see his stuff coming up here. Okay. Now I got to organize my windows and we'll be ready. Thanks for joining us once again. I'm Sammy K. Powers, and this is the PHP Roundtable. This is a live podcast of developers discussing topics that PHP nerds care about. The ultimate goal of this podcast is to learn a little something from each other. We don't assume that you, the listener, is a PHP expert, so we'll try our best to fully explain the concepts that we're discussing so that even a complete newbie will have at least enough information to take their learning further with a good Google search. If you're listening live and want to be part of the conversation, send a tweet to PHP Roundtable with a question, and we will try to get your question answered if we can. Excuse me. In the programming community, we're constantly being bombarded with acronyms like MVC, CRUD, OOP, TDD, POPO, and on and on. Today, we're going to throw another one at you, DDD, or Domain-Driven Design. DDD is a design pattern that can help us write better code. First, we'll try to tackle the essence of DDD as a set of abstract ideas and principles that help us deal with the complexities in software. Then we'll dive deep into tactical DDD, exploring concepts like entities, value objects, services, domain events, aggregates, factories, and on and on. Finally, we'll take it a bit further and discuss an unrelated but concurrent subject called hexagonal architecture and explore how DDD can play nicely with hexagonal architecture like two pretty peas in a pod. That's what we have lined up. Let's meet our roundtable guests. In no particular order, he's the guy behind serversforhackers.com, and he's done a talk and wrote a lot about hexagonal architecture. It's Mr. Chris Fidal. Welcome.
Howdy. How's it going?
Howdy. Doing well. Thanks for coming on, man. I really appreciate you coming on.
Sure.
Also, we have at the table an engineer, coach, and consultant for companies to help them improve their development practices, and he's a talking hat, apparently. It's Mr. Ross Tuck.
Welcome, hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. And finally, he gives workshops about domain-driven design, advises companies on DDD architecture and legacy code, and he's the organizer of DDD Belgium. Highly appropriate for this conversation. It's Mr. Matthias Fauras. Did I say that right?
More or less. Good enough.
Matthias Fauras. I've been working on it. I have this nice pronunciation key of your name here, but you know, my bachelor's in linguistics doesn't always help me in these situations.
Even I fail at pronouncing my own name sometimes. So.
Oh, good. I don't have to feel bad then. All right, so let's jump right into it with our guests. The essence of DDD. We hear DDD all the time, or at least I do in this community. I feel like PHP, it's the new hotness to talk about domain-driven design, DDD, not to be confused with TDD. When we were discussing before we started the show how to kind of approach this subject, we started realizing that there's sort of these two kind of veins that we could go, like the essence of DDD as these abstract ideas, and then like some of the more tactical DDD, like implementation details and things. And I wanted to kind of talk with you guys about clarifying those two sort of veins, if you will. If you had to succinctly describe the essence of domain-driven design, Matthias, how would you define the essence of DDD?
Well, it's a set of principles and ideas to help deal with complexity in software, and we usually have a lot of that. I think the important thing is, first and foremost, is you have to grasp the domain. You have to understand the world of the client, of the business problem that you're trying to solve. You have to obsess over the language. That's a big part in domain-driven design. It's called ubiquitous language. So you really think about what things are called and how the business people talk about it. You have to continuously reiterate over your model that you build. So you build a model of your problem domain, of your solution actually, and you keep evolving this as you go along. And there's more. You have to worry about the boundaries between your different parts of your system. You don't try to build this one big monolith. You try to build smaller parts that work together, and you think about how they do that. So in essence, it's about I would say accepting that there's complexity and accepting that you cannot reduce this complexity by having a very simple system. If the problem is complex, you cannot have a simple system, or not in a, how should I put it? Not in an easy way. You cannot ignore this complexity.
Right. Well,
If that makes sense.
You mentioned domain, and for somebody who's just starting into this whole area, how would you describe the domain? I mean, it's part of the name, so it's got to be important, right?
Yeah. Well, the domain is a problem space. It's the world of the client. If they are in finance or automotive, that would be the domain, very high level. But usually you would try to dig deeper. Of course, they're not just a transportation company or a warehousing company. There's more to them that is important. For example, in warehousing, I was just last month with a client. For them, the way they make money is actually by optimizing the walking distance for the order pickers in the warehouse. So that is actually their domain. It's optimizing walking distances. So and your model is just a solution to make that work.
So it's more of a concept in real world. How does it relate to, say, when someone says the business logic of your application? You know, putting all the main business logic. Is that sort of related to the domain, or are those talking about two different concepts?
Well, the things you actually do implement, that's a choice. That's your solution, or the solution you agree to with your client. The domain might be bigger. You don't try to model the entire world. You don't try to model the entire domain. You model the things that are important to them. So what you build is, we call it a domain model. Basically, it's an abstraction. It's just a subset of elements that you believe are important for your application. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I got a question for Ross here about, for someone who is familiar with MVC and the incorrect implementation of MVC, and they jam all of their main business logic in the controllers and things like that. How would you explain what the domain is and where that should go in that kind of concept? I know it's kind of a convoluted, weird question there, but what would be your advice to someone who's trying to follow MVC but also implement like this idea of like containing their domain and business logic?
Well, I think that's something we'll probably get a little bit more in depth to when we turn to the tactical side of these things. But like, as a short answer, I would say that MVC and domain-driven design are totally orthogonal to each other. They're really just like two independent things, and you can have them both under the same application, under the same roof, perfectly fine. I would say that in this case, like, it's important to realize that the domain and the domain model is actually totally separate than what your code is. It's different than what you're writing. So it's like something that you would create not in code, but on a whiteboard or with post-it notes or something like that. It's like something you actually sit down and figure out, and then the process of capturing that in code, of translating it into code, that's a separate step of it altogether. The code is almost an artifact of the model you create. So that's, like, at a high level, that's sort of how I'd approach it, is like, don't set out as your first goal to go ahead and create a I'm trying to think of an actual example here. I once worked with somebody on railway safety. I didn't sit down to start out and write a railway safety application. Instead, what I did was I sat down and tried to understand railways first. So I actually asked them for, like, what's your intro manual to, like, your very first new employees? And you try and understand a little bit about that railway knowledge first. I worked for an insurance software company one time where somebody on the staff, even though they worked in a software company, became an actual licensed insurance broker so that they could better understand what was going on in the system where they were working. So, like, that kind of commitment to understanding that knowledge first, and then once you do that, like, there's a set of practices and patterns and stuff like that to use to help you get that stuff into the code, but it's actually kind of a different thing.
That's an excellent answer. I mean, it took a guided question and totally answered it the way that, domain-driven design is what it's all about. And I really like that, because as programmers, we tend to just jump right into the code and like, okay, now how do we start implementing? But I like the way that you described domain-driven design as sort of like you try to wrap your head around the the real world objects, right? You're trying to figure out what the business is, like what are their actions, what do they do, what do they call things, and then you try to bring those concepts into your code as you write it. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And in fact, this is, I think Matthias touched on this real quick, that there's sort of two separate streams within DDD. And if you want to be, I guess, proper about it, and Matthias is probably more qualified to talk about this part of it, but there's really strategic DDD, and that's like the high level, how do we map this, how do we understand those kinds of concepts? And then there's tactical DDD, which is how do we encode that in code? And strategic DDD is like, that's actually, I think Evans has said that's the important part of the book, is understanding that part. And then the rest of it are tech practices that we use to try and capture that, and those evolve over time. So like one of the hot things we talk about these days is domain events. That's not in the original stuff. Actually, it's something that came later, but it turns out to be really, really valuable. So the core of DDD is the strategic stuff and trying to understand that, and it's a little fuzzy, and it's a little consultancy, and it's a little project managery sometimes, but it's also kind of interesting and fun. Part of what I love about my job is learning these different domains. But the tactical stuff, that evolves and that iterates a lot quicker, and that's just like, what do we actually do in code?
So Eric Evans said at a certain point that he actually didn't want to include the design patterns in the book and just have the strategic stuff. But his publisher wanted him to put it in there, or he wanted to have it as an appendix. But this other guy, very famous guy called Ross Tuck, said that the design patterns are actually like a gateway drug to domain-driven design. So you start by trying to implement these things in your code. You start by using value objects and entities and repositories. These sort of patterns, these building blocks, to help you write better code, and you evolve into learning more about modeling and really thinking about the domain and the language. The goal in the end, I think one of the core ideas in domain-driven design is not to have like a separate analysis model and a domain model, but have these two synchronized all the time. If you learn something new in the domain, you adapt your model. If you have a new feature that doesn't fit in your model, you adapt your model. And so you adapt the code, you adapt your documentation, your understanding, your mental models. It should all synchronize, basically.
So, Chris, we haven't heard from you in a second. Would it be correct to say that the essence of DDD is to refactor your code in iterations and with each iteration you kind of get closer and closer to this real-world model that we've been talking about of your app?
Is that accurate? Sure.
Is it? Yeah. Is that would be like the essence of DDD, right?
Yeah. I've always understood it. I mean, it's kind of like what Matthias just said. It's really about coming up with a language and way to describe the problem, the business problem, and putting that, on a whiteboard, but eventually into code as well. So, I mean, that is the essence of it, because what you want to do is describe the business problem, get the most value out of your code, and then also have the most valuable code also be the highest quality. The quality comes from testing and stuff like that, but also from its clarity and how well it meets the purpose. So like the authentication portion of your code might not be a big deal, but the part where you write code that talks about the traveling sales problem and walking around a warehouse and what's the most efficient way, that should be really distilled. So yeah, I mean, I think that would be a totally accurate statement.
So is it really? Would it be correct to say that DDD is a design pattern? But since we're talking about it being tactical versus, the essence of DDD, is one of those a design pattern, one is not, or is the whole thing considered a design pattern?
No. Well, I mean, I'm thinking of design patterns as a very specific thing. The common patterns we use in code to solve like kind of micro problems. And micro problems is like if I have multiple implementations of different databases, how do I put that under one common interface so I don't have to write all this custom code for each database I might use, which is like a framework use case. But, and there are design patterns to meet that and other cases. But that's very code specific and gets away from the idea of domain-driven design, which is not really a design pattern, but a way to work with the people who are important to the business, so work with the stakeholders to develop a common language and transform that into code that makes sense to everybody.
So when we talk about the tactical DDD in a second, when we're talking about value objects, entities, services, and things like that, would you say that those are design patterns or a design pattern to implement this concept of DDD?
I mean, there's design patterns in there, but
Oh.
like a DTO isn't really a design pattern. It's just a data transfer object. It's just an object that has data in it that doesn't really have behavior. So that's not really like a design pattern, but a tool you use, and it's a tool commonly used in domain-driven design, and plenty of other places. But it's talked about the most to me, it seems, in context of DDD.
So it's kind of interesting to see that DDD, I just kind of assumed like, oh, another design pattern, but it's actually a lot more than that, and there's it's a kind of a bigger deal, and then there's a bunch of subsets where you can have design patterns within these concepts and things like that. So this is a tough subject to kind of tackle when you're brand new to it. So
Big, it's a big topic.
it is. Hey, wait a minute, didn't David Hansen DHH on Twitter say that DDD was dead?
Now you're just trolling.
I'm just trolling. He actually said TDD was dead, test-driven design. Okay, so I wanted to actually, before we jump into the tactical DDD stuff, I wanted to take an objective look at this DDD. I know you guys are big DDD fans, but let's look at the strengths and weaknesses. In what situations does DDD particularly excel at? Matthias, you want to take that one, or?
Sure. Well, it's about complexity, as I mentioned. So if you're building a simple block and it's a 3-week project, then you probably won't get a lot of value out of it. And so what happens is people try their hand at it, and then they spend twice the time building a 6-week project. They take 3 months, and they complain that DDD doesn't work. And of course, it won't work in these situations. You have to take into account that it is about complexity. It will be hard. It's a hard book to read. It will take time to learn and to master. I'm still learning every day.
So is it so you're saying it works best for bigger projects, kind of?
Yeah, and especially if
little blogs.
If the domain is complex, and if sometimes there is no maybe it's complex, but there's not really a domain, in the sense that if you're building a database, then your biggest problem is not going to be communicate with clients and learn their language. You have very technical problems. You probably wouldn't apply domain-driven design there either.
Right. Actually, Frank Peters on Twitter has just tweeted that DDD really helped them grasp the concept that the client wanted to convey, and it says he makes working much easier as we speak the same language. So if you're using the same language as the client in your code, then that I guess that would make a lot more sense to kind of be one.
You get rid of a lot of translation issues, of course, there, and communication issues. And I'd like to add actually that even though it's not advised to use DDD for a small project, if you can afford it, then actually do apply DDD on a small project, because now you can start to get familiar with some of the ideas and learn it. And you'd rather learn something on a small risk-free project than on your first big project. And now we're going to try something we've never tried before. That's also one of the ways that people tend to fail with DDD.
They try to take too big of a chunk instead of trying it on a little guy, just a little project. Yeah.
So it's a balance, of course, but you have to
Absolutely.
experiment and learn and accept that it won't be easy to change your way of thinking, especially if you have a large team and people with different experiences. It might take some time for them to get into this mindset.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. When I first got into testing, it took me a really long time to wrap my mind around those concepts. Are there any other drawbacks other than maybe not using it with a small project? Are there any other drawbacks of DDD that you guys can think of before we jump into tactical stuff?
No, always works.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
I can think of a couple cases where it's perhaps a little bit less suitable, like as Matthias mentioned, like shorter-term projects, for example. I mean, it's kind of like OOP in that sense, right? Is OOP worth using for a 3-line shell script? Well, probably not. I mean, but will it pay itself back over a time scale? So you have to consider it in that light as well. I also think that it's often not encouraged to use when you have a team that's perhaps already making a really big leap, for example, and they might be biting off more than they can chew at one time. And I've also had mixed results trying to use it in domains or rather with clients who weren't sure what their domain was, like, for example, in a startup or perhaps an older business or something like that, where people were not actually completely sure how their business ran. It just sort of ran and generated money, and they weren't, or it was very technical, and they didn't actually understand what some things were happening in the bowels of the company, so to speak. And in those cases, it's an investment in the company to understand itself and what it does better, and it may or may not be worthwhile, especially if it's a tech-driven choice.
Cool.
To add to that, I have a background that's more on the marketing side of development. So it was a lot of like CMS work and one-off sites for like things that lasted a month or 2 months. Or if it was a custom site and actually had custom code in the background, it would probably be simple enough not to require or use DDD. That and of course like the varying skill levels of the people working with you, or the client buy-in on their desire to even spend time with you on the project. It all varies completely depending on your client. So there's cases where like whole companies might not even think of that idea, just because of who their clientele is and that kind of. There's all of these instances where it might not be worth diving in that deep.
And it is an approach that exposes problems sooner if you apply domain-driven design well. And then you'll always have people who say, hey, wait a minute, where are all these problems coming from? We didn't have them before, so they blame you or they blame domain-driven design. Of course, you had them, you just didn't know about it. But if you are in an environment where there's a blame culture and people are not open to these ideas, then you risk being the bad guy who creates the problems.
Definitely. I think that's a really great point, actually, because when you use the strategic part of it and you really sort of dive in trying to understand and model the company and how it works and stuff like that, you find out like how scarily fragile a lot of these bigger organizations are, and sometimes just how isolated individual components are.
Wow. So that's actually a pro and a con. It uncovers these ugly problems, but then you get blamed for uncovering, or maybe even blamed for the problem itself. But I feel like that would be a really good thing to uncover problems. So that's a really great strength of DDD. If someone watching is sold on the idea of DDD, they say they really like this concept of trying to model the real world domain and try to implement that in their code. I'm assuming they're going to be running up against a number of terms that get thrown around quite a bit in DDD when we're talking about tactical DDD or trying to implement that into our code specifically. So I wanted to kind of go over a couple of these commonly used terms, and I wanted to start with. And this might not even be the best ones to start with. Like I'm just kind of throwing these things out there. I actually am not a DDD expert. That's why you guys are here. But if we started with entities and value objects, kind of looking at both of those together, because I feel like they're related, but they're different, right? Or am I just way off? Anyone want to take that? Ross? I'm a Chris. Chris, you start. You look like
I mean, that's not. Matthias will be able to describe this better. I'll give it a shot.
Give it.
Go for it.
Okay. Also, hop in, Matthias, if you want. I see. So entities and value objects. Value objects. I'll start first. Kind of what the name implies. It's an object that has a value, and its main purpose is mostly to. Well, okay. So I also seen some other conflicting things with this, but its purpose is to have a value and maybe to do some light stuff that's related to that value. So like if you have a value object that's supposed to hold an email address, maybe it has some information about what makes up an email address. Whereas an entity is part of your domain model. It is describing a thing in the domain model. Matthias, do you have a good example of what an entity would be? I feel like you've worked with, like, from your...
Anything like a customer or I don't know, a shipment, even a transaction, basically anything that you would identify and identify over time. So a value object is just something that represents a single value basically at a single point in time. If I give you 5 euros or dollars or whatever you have over there, and you give me another $5 note back, I don't care. It's a different identity. It's a different note, but it's the same value. I don't care about the identity of the banknote. unless I'm a bank, then I would use the numbers that they put on banknotes to identify this. Now I'm confusing the issue, of course.
No, but I think you bring up a great point, because you just said that you used the dollar or any kind of banknote or anything like that. We'll just say U.S. dollar, because that's what I'm familiar with. In one program, it would be an entity, and another program it would be a value object, right? Because it depends on who cares about that dollar, right? In the context of a bank, it matters the exact identification of this exact dollar, whereas in my Foo app, it's just like, it's a dollar. Nobody really cares what dollar it is, right? Is that kind of the difference between value object and entities?
Exactly, and it's not a technical problem deciding whether something is a value object or an entity. It's a domain problem. If you understand your domain, if you understand that banks care about the individual banknotes, or at least the organization that prints the money, they care about it, then if you understand this, then you can solve this problem not in a technical way. You draw your solution from the domain. And so entities are things where you do care about the individual instance of it. If I have two customers and they have the same name for some reason, or two users, and they have the same name, they are still different people. So they have a different identity. We will use a pseudo key like an auto increment or a UUID to identify them, because we cannot trust the name as their identity. Or maybe we would use an identifier from the domain, like a social security number or a license plate for a car. Those are natural keys for entities. But the important thing is that these things can change over time. Maybe you will change your address, maybe you will change your name or your email address, but you are still the same person. That's why you are an entity. Well, or we represent you as an entity in our system, in our model. And I think that entities are well understood, because everybody uses them in some way. They have something in the database that they identify with an identifier. And often we have objects to represent this record in this database. But for value objects, they are, at least in the PHP world, they're very much underused. In object-oriented design, as it was conceived, everything is an object. So, and everything is an object that represents something, preferably from the real world, even though that's a little a shaky concept, because what is the real world? But if you have an email address, you can represent this as a string, but it has no meaning when it's just a string. When you have an object called email or email address, and it contains this string internally, then you transcend this. Now you have something that can only be an email address. It's very concrete. And you use it for things, especially it's useful for things like email addresses, even though the only behavior that you would have there would be the validation of this email address. Is this actually a valid email address? But for things like money, it becomes even more interesting, because you have multiple values that you combine. You don't say 5. I owe you 5. That doesn't work. I owe you $5 or €5. So this currency and this amount, they belong together. We need something to wrap these two values in and see them as one concept. So that would be a money object, and you can keep building on this. Let's see. You could represent more complex structures based on smaller structures. This is also an idea in object-oriented. This is not just domain-driven design. For example, you could have a calendar, and this calendar consists of days and months and appointments and all these things. Basically, the way you would build this, you would start by making value objects for every possible concept in there, and then you would identify the ones that need an identity because they change over time. For example, November 7th, 2015 will always be November 7th, 2015. There's no identity to this date itself, but if I have an appointment on that date, that appointment can change. It can move to a new date. It can have a new invited person in there. It can have new descriptions, all these things. So it evolves, so it needs an identity.
So could an entity have value objects as properties or attributes?
Yes, exactly. That's
cool.
the point. So your appointment object would be an entity. It would have an ID. and it would have a bunch of value objects. For example, a date time, which is a typical example, of course. Maybe the attendees could be value objects, or they might be just IDs of entities. Depends on your solution.
Right.
And then
Well,
the location and all these things could be value objects.
Right. Well, so we have a question from Frank Peters on Twitter, which is actually kind of funny because it was sort of related to a question I was going to ask you guys. In that, when we were talking about entities and value objects being separate, could have two very different meanings in two different contexts. Do you guys ever have a really big project that you've been working on and then switch to another really big project that's got a different domain, and something that you've been treating as an entity in this domain is being treated as a value object in this domain? Does that ever have you ever had that situation happen first? And then second of all, is it easy to switch in your head between the two, start treating it as an entity versus a value object, or is that even an issue the way that you code it?
Well, this is basically the problem of boundaries, and in domain-driven design we call it bounded context, that something can have a different meaning depending on where you are and who you talk to, and the classic example is a product. If you ask somebody at Amazon what is a product, if you're talking to the sales guy, he will say, oh, it's something we can sell that has some pictures and some customer reviews and descriptions and a price. If you ask the shipping department, they say it's something we have to bring from A to B. And if you ask the inventory or the stock people, they will say, oh, it's a box and we always have too many of them or too few of them. So these people have different models of what a product is. They can still communicate because the human brain is good with nuance and context, but our computers are not. So we try to create boundaries and different contexts. And then, of course, as a developer, it helps if you have physical boundaries. If these are two separate repositories, one for GitHub repositories or whatever, one for the product catalog and one for the shipping department, you always know in which context you are, so that makes it easier.
Cool. Well, it's sort of related to Frank's question. Frank Peters on Twitter is that how would you deal with big changes in the domain language? Do you guys run into that where the domain really changes big? Ross, it looks like you have something to say.
Refactor. Yeah. If it's all feasible, refactor. I think that's like one of the kind of scary things about DDD actually is that it really needs, for a longer term project, you have to have that courage to refactor. And there are people who talk about having the courage to refactor and the things you need in order to do that safely, like tests are being one of the big ones, of course. But if you begin to get a mismatch there, then my advice is you should probably try and correct that as quickly as you can, because over time it will continue to diverge and diverge and diverge further, and you will basically accrue technical debt, maybe not in the traditional sense, but you will accrue it, and you'll have to pay that back at some point, actually. The longer the mismatch continues, the easier it is to get off base. So my advice is, like, if it's at all possible, then try and refactor. And if you turn out to be drastically wrong and there's no budget for it or something like that, then you may have to take stopgap measures like document the crap out of it, which is not as good, but that's a case of it. Or consider, like, how can we work around this in the near future with a sacrificial architecture? How can I encapsulate this? How can I put a wrapper around this so that it's closer? I've joked that this is sometimes called the everybody poops rule. Like, everybody poops, but you don't do it in every room in your house. You try and keep it in one place.
That's such a great analogy. I've got that book sitting over my toilet, by the way.
It's not a great thing to do, but it's sometimes you have to.
I have an example of I was working in domain and they had something called observations, and so we built this what we think they need, and then as our understanding grows and actually their own understanding, because they were evolving their domain as they were figuring out how, or as we were all figuring out how to build a system for this, it turned out that observations could also be the form you use to register observations on. It could be the actual act of observing somebody. It could be the actual act of registering this observation on this form. And this was very messy. So it was messy in the domain. They didn't have a language for that because they had nuance, because everybody knew if somebody says, where's that pile of observations, then you know you're talking about physical papers. So you don't need as much clarity if you're just talking to humans. And because we were talking to computers, of course, trying to build a system for that, we had to refactor this a couple of times. And well, the practical way of doing it, there's all these kind of tricks that you can do, like rename something to a temporary name and then introduce something else, or write your test for the new situation first, then adapt your system and then throw away the old test, and all these kinds of things that are, well, basically refactoring techniques. There's books written about that if you're interested.
You brought up a good point about that domain, though, right? Like when there's an established domain and you go into a company and they're like, oh, this is how everything is named, this is how we've done it for years. Domain-driven design seems fairly easy, right? You take their concepts, bring it in. But what if you're working with a startup? They don't know what's going on. They're going every which way. How does that really should influence your code even more than if you weren't implementing domain-driven design, right?
Yeah, and I think that's makes it even more important to really worry about it, because it's going to evolve. It's going to be messy. There's going to be a lot of complexity that if somebody who comes into this company 2 years later and looks at the code and says, why is this such a complex mess? That's because they lack this historical narrative. They don't know how the code got that way. They didn't go through this process. And then you come in and you start simplifying things and you feel like a hero. This is because at this point the domain has maybe stabilized, especially in startups.
It seems like there's going to be a feedback loop there too. Like whatever they change in the code could influence the company, and then the company will influence the code, and that cycle and that iteration and the feedback loop will create something very tightly coupled in a good way.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at systems thinking and complexity theory, feedback loops are, well, they're everything. They're everywhere. That's why things are complex. You change something in one end, and it changes everything in some other place you didn't think of. That's what complexity is about. So how do you deal with this? Well, if you this is something actually from biology. There's a law that says the more adapted a system is to its environment, the less adaptable it is. So they're talking about organisms, about living things. But this goes for software as well. If your software, if your model is very adapted to one very specific situation, the way it is today, then tomorrow, if a lot of things change, you'll be in trouble. But if you are in the habit of constantly adapting and changing the most important things and the most critical things and the things that make you the most money, then the habit of changing becomes part of the structure of the system, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this is a really interesting point too. It's not directly related to what we're talking about, but I think that this is a really good advantage of domain-driven design on a practical scale, because you talked about that historical narrative. Like, how many of us have ever picked up a project and somebody says, "Oh, so this is the thing I need to change for that user." No. That's from an old thing. It's actually this field now, and yeah, this dirty hacks on top of that to make it work. If you do the domain-driven design part of it right, then hopefully you won't have those moments as much. I mean, you have to go around the company, you have to learn what they do and so on, but hopefully the act of reading the code will teach you a little bit about what the company does, and hopefully what you learn about the company around the lunch table will clue you in better into the code and why it's written that way. You don't have as many of these WTF translation points, hopefully.
Nice. It just seems like there's just so much awesome value that comes out of DDD when working in a company that why wouldn't you use it? I was wanting to define a few other terms before we move on to something called hexagonal architecture, which Chris is a big fan of. So what are services when we're talking about TDD? I'm sorry, DDD, not to confuse the two, make it even more confusing. Ross, you want to take that one on, services?
Sure. So a service is kind of it's sort of this extra layer that if you're coming from an MVC standpoint, that you would sort of jam in between your model, which is kind of the representation of the domain model, and the controller. So anything that's interacting with that domain model would go through the service first. So this doesn't just have to be a controller like in a web MVC type architecture, but it could also be a command line application that we run for admin purposes. It could be a queue worker. It could be anything that's really accessing that, and they all go through the service layer. And so it's not just one object, but it's an entire layer of the app itself. And that gives you like a really nice consistent interface for it. It lets you decide what you want to expose and what you don't. It helps you capture the user intent of what you're trying to do. So in that sense, it's really, really useful to have. I don't think that a service layer is per se a requirement for getting DDD. It's a really handy pattern or tool that goes along with it. but it's not something that you must have from the ground up, though it's certainly a good idea.
That's probably something that you would end up coding at the end, right? Because you're writing all these components at at the smallest level you can, right? And you're trying to make everything really bite-sized. But a service, would you say, is the thing that kind of ties all those components together? It just you see all these use statements at the top of a service, and it makes them all work together and to give the developer a nice, clean API to use.
Well, I originally got the term application service from Von Vernon, and he had this idea that, like when you say service, it really doesn't mean anything, right? Service is just a term we use for object these days, practically, right? But when he says application service, he's really saying like the thing that ties this stuff together into being an actual application, so to speak. What order you write that in, I'm not sure. Like Everzet, the guy behind Behat, he has this really great idea about you want to write the models first, you want to do that against your use cases and get that as quickly as you can. Then maybe you do the service, then the UI. Maybe some people prefer to mock out the UI first. I don't know. I'm not sure it's important, but I haven't really formed a strong opinion on it.
Actually, I think that services are overused. Most of your business logic, most of your behavior should be pushed as deep down as possible. So it would actually end up in your value objects, most of it. And people are surprised when I tell them this. They have it in their service layers, or maybe they have it in the entities, but they don't put behavior in the value objects. Actually, that's where most of it can end up. And then you would try to identify other things. Value objects and entities are still things. There's a lot of other things that are not things that you would implement as objects. I'm thinking about business rules, for example. I would have a lot of objects that represent, every object could represent a single business rule. So the responsibility for interpreting this or enforcing this rule would be in this specific object. It would not be in a service. If you put all this business logic in a service, if the service is coordinating everything, then basically you end up with the procedural code. It's still in objects, but this service, if this becomes long, if it has a lot of dependencies, that's a smell that it's an indication that you are writing procedural code. So I try to find all these concepts and make them explicit. If there's some rule that some group of people can only have 5 members at most, I might end up, depends on how detailed I want to go, but I might end up with an object that says or a class that is called a group can only have 5 members, and this object would be used that's not a good name. It would be something like a group membership limit or something that enforces this rule wherever I do something with. And this object would actually be inside this group entity probably. So this group entity would enforce its own limit. So there's very little left that actually ends up in services. What does end up there is stuff that doesn't naturally belong to a single value object or a single entity. If you have to do something with like a transaction that crosses multiple groups, for example, there's no natural or logical place for that to be inside a group, because which of the 5 groups would be responsible for coordinating the other 4? That's a weird problem. If you feel this kind of friction, then that might be an indication that you need something that wraps around these things. So I still consider services. Domain services are part of the domain layer for me. They are part of the model of the solution. And of course, you can still have application services, which are more technical things like, managing transactions or things like that, or coordinating stuff that is not necessarily part of your domain model, but more of your technical layers around it.
No, I totally agree with you that the way it's normally done within PHP especially is that the service in the layer ends up leeching all of that logic out of the model layer, and that's totally the wrong approach. That what you end up with there is like what Fowler would call transaction scripts. They're just these long scripts, basically is what you get, and that's a really, really bad move. And I also think people fall into this trap too of thinking that that it's about a model object, or it's about a service object, or it's about a value object, and not that it's about layers. We talk about originally, especially in the original DDD book, it's all about entities, it's all about value objects, but these days we actually have pretty rich terms for that stuff. We have events, we have commands, we have value objects, we have models, we have domain services, sagas, you name it, right? There's all these different things that come in, and we should be inventing new things there all the time, right? Why be limited to just these patterns that we have names for? Why not keep making new ones? And so we fall into this trap of thinking, well, there's a service object, so I should have a service object and a model object, whatever. And that's just the path to lasagna code. That's a trap that a lot of people fall into. And I think there's another good misunderstanding there that a lot of people have, which I think you raised correctly, which is the difference between an application service, which are these very technical layers, like I'm doing a lot with command buses lately. That's an application service. That's a place to hang application stuff in my mind. On the other hand, you have a domain service, which coordinates different aggregates or different entities or value objects or whatever. Like it's those little pieces of cross, aggregate action or interaction is a better way to put it. Those are places where, the names are very similar, application service, domain service, but they mean radically, radically different things. And so I think like getting that terminology right to a lot of people or not getting it right is a source of a lot of confusion.
Nicholas Wittert on Twitter just asked us to disambiguate application/domain/infrastructure layers, and I think maybe Chris, do you want to take this one on just to help us? We've been tossing these things around when we're talking about like the service layer, application services versus just what domain services. Chris, like how do we differentiate these different layers, application, domain, infrastructure, all this kind of stuff? This will probably tie into later on, I guess.
Yeah, right. And like hexagonal architecture gets into a layered architecture of code. So really important was the distinction we just made of application services versus DDD services. Whereas like an application service is kind of like some plumbing stuff, and a DDD service is still within the domain, still uses the ubiquitous language of the problem you're talking about. And then we get into the idea of layers of stuff in our code. So I mean, Nicholas asked about application layer, domain layer. So this really gets into hexagonal architecture. I don't know if we want to move into that yet.
We'll put a bookmark in it because we just got to define 4 more terms real quick, and then we can move on to hexagonal architecture.
Yeah,
Nicholas, sorry I brought that up a little prematurely, but thanks for the question because that's totally tying into what we're going into next. But before we do move on, let's get 4 more terms defined really quickly. Domain events.
Okay, so it's something that happens in the business or that happened in the past that the business is interested in. That would be my definition of domain event. Actually, it's Craig Young's definition, but I like it very much. And this ties into the language again. I would try to find a way that people talk about things, and that's actually how business people talk. When this has happened, then this should happen, or when this and this and this has happened, then that should be the result of it. They don't talk. At least they shouldn't talk in terms of structure. They shouldn't say, when I click this button, the state of this object changes to published or something like that. That's a very developer or data-centric way of thinking, a state-centric way of thinking. With domain events, you can express this in a much more natural way. You can say, given somebody has published an article and given the editor of the newspaper has objected to this publication, then the article should be retracted. This is terminology that fits the way they have conversations in their domain. So in the practical terms, what is a domain event? You implement this as a simple object. It's a simple object that has a name. So I actually use this sentence, article was published or article was retracted. I would write it like this as the class name. And then you have some properties, maybe the ID of the article and the date and maybe the ID of the person who retracted it. So just some properties. So it's a very simple object. But now you have something that you can move around and that you can have other parts of your system react to, like a projector or process manager or anything. Or you can persist this object somewhere. You can have a history of all the things that have ever happened to your system.
Cool.
So I introduced some new terms now, of course, but
yeah, some new terms. Well, let's just define the last three here I've got on the list. Ross, do you want to take on aggregates? What those are?
Okay. That's a tricky one, actually. Aggregates are kind of like, they're like a collection of models, would be a way to put it, right? So you have, within an aggregate, you have a model at the top called an aggregate root, and that's the one that all the others come from. And then it is sort of the one that all the others refer to. I'm trying to think of a good example here. What can I talk about without violating an NDA? Okay, so let's say that we have, for example, we have a book, and a book has, I don't know, a list of chapters. It's a terrible example. Do one of you guys have another one? Chris, do you have a good idea?
I think what you had was good, just because you can make the analogy of the book being the aggregate and the chapters being like the models inside of it. Although I don't know if that's that great, but
maybe something like invoice and line items.
Yeah,
order and line item. That's a classic. That's great.
Anything with money.
Yeah, exactly.
Money.
All about the bling, baby. So you have an order. An order has multiple line items on it, right? So you always refer to the order by an order number. That would be the aggregate ID. And then you would only care about the order in the context of everything around it. Now, within the order, on the other hand, you might have other objects inside of it. Like you might have the date the order was issued. That would probably be a really good value object. If you care about VAT/MOS, you might have the IP address of the person who made the order. That would be another really good value object. And then you would also maybe have a set of line items. All right, so the individual things that you ordered there with, say, the price at that date and time. And those would probably be value objects as well. So the aggregate is like this model at the top that kind of binds all these things together. It's like the force, right? It ties us all together there. And so you would only care about the order and the context of stuff. It manages the things inside of it. It manages the line items, no matter how many there are. But that's kind of what you would refer to. And we call this whole thing together an aggregate. It's an aggregate of models or value objects or whatever we find handy, basically. And it's the one that's the root is responsible for the life cycle, the maintenance, the linkage of all the other objects associated with it.
I think it's important to note that this is actually part of your model and not necessarily part of your domain, even though, of course, an invoice is part of your domain. But the fact that you make this aggregate to represent this invoice and not just an entity, not just a bunch of invoice entities and a bunch of line items entities or order entities, whatever. But the fact that the reason you make an aggregate out of it is because this makes it a transaction boundary. So this doesn't matter if you have a fairly simple system with a single relational database and you can just do transactions on top of everything. But transactions are costly. If you want to start scaling your system, then transactions can really slow it down. So you need to define boundaries where you will have transactions and everything out of this boundary will not be transactional or will not be guaranteed to be immediately consistent the whole time. So in the case of my invoice, I could make this boundary smaller. I could say that my boundary is just line items. The problem with that would be that if I have business rules over the entire invoice, it would be hard to enforce them because I only have line items and they're just objects on their own. So I make this invoice aggregate that represents the whole thing. But you could actually make your aggregate bigger. If you have, let's say you have a business rule that says that within a certain contract you can only have 5 invoices. I don't know why, but it seems like a silly rule. But if you want to enforce this rule in an immediately consistent way with transactions where it's always guaranteed to either fail together or succeed together, any operation you do on it, then you would make the entire contract your aggregate, and the invoices would just be entities inside this aggregate. You can even take this further and make the whole customer an aggregate, or the whole company, but of course then you would lock the whole company whenever something happens. So that would be too big of an aggregate.
So how would you define an entity versus an aggregate? So like, for example, if I was just getting into DDD, I'd say, oh, an invoice, that's an entity, because it's got an ID and it's got value objects.
It is an entity, but we designate So we have this object graph, and an invoice is an object graph with line items and maybe other things in there as well. And we designate one of these elements as the root element, as the aggregate root, and we make all communication go through this root so it can enforce any business rules or invariants that apply to it. Maybe this invoice doesn't allow amounts over $1,000, just making up crappy business rules here. So the aggregate is the concept of this invoice as a transaction boundary. So invoice is still an entity, line items are still entities, but the line items are child entities of this invoice parent entity. So it's just an object graph, and we call this an aggregate, and it's a convention that we say when we do transactions, we only do a transaction on one aggregate at the same time. So if we have a business rule about multiple invoices at the same time, or maybe about invoices and something else, we wouldn't do this in a transaction. We would do these transactions separately, which means there's a risk of inconsistencies, but that's kind of the risk you deal with if you have large, complex distributed systems. But none of this applies if you have a fairly simple system where you can just do a transaction. Then it doesn't really matter that much to have aggregates.
Well, it's interesting that there's a lot of, it seems like there's a little bit of bleeding into these terms, like entities and aggregates kind of seem similar in ways, or entity being a, being an aggregate, and so it's kind of hard, I think, when you first get into it to kind of wrap your head around these, when a lot of these kind of concepts kind of overlap a little bit.
And it can get more complex because, well, an entity is something that is an entity in the domain. You are a customer. You can change over time. Even if I don't represent you as an entity in my model, you are still an entity.
Right.
If that makes sense. But aggregates do not exist. They are my choice as a developer to implement the customer entity as an aggregate, give it these responsibilities, give it this transaction boundary. That's my choice. I don't want to go talk to my domain expert or to my customer and explain to them what aggregates are and how would you like your aggregates. That doesn't make sense. But I would ask questions about do we expect these things to change over time, or do we expect these things to never change? These are the sort of questions I would ask.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I want to just underline that point as well, actually, that an aggregate is essentially, it's a tactical pattern. It's just an implementation technique that we use. It's a tool in that. It's not a holy grail. And in fact, the closest thing that I could think of, honestly, to something that actually exists as an aggregate, and this is a joke I've used with a couple people, is follow the paperwork. Because if you look at what's on a document or a piece of paperwork, like a purchase order or a request for something or whatever, then you'll often find that, oh, well, that's actually everything you need to know right there. That's a bit of intent. It usually has some sort of boundary baked into it. And also, if you look at where that piece of paperwork flows through the system actually and who it goes to or something, then you'll kind of understand also perhaps about where some of your context boundaries lie, for example, where where this message actually needs to be spread to. There's a joke that paperwork is message passing for humans. But this is, again, just a way of implementing it. It's not a holy grail thing.
And at the risk of completely losing our audience now, it's even a little bit more complex because the definition of aggregate sort of evolved over time, especially with event sourcing, which is a way of making domain events even more important in your system and making them the first-class citizens. And then you could define an aggregate as something that implements a process, so a series of events happening over time that belong logically together and that have business rules guaranteeing their consistency over time. But I think this is maybe for a next.
This is a philosophical discussion coming up here. There seems like there's enough.
The quick summary for this one basically is that aggregate design is one of those things where everybody feels like that should be one of the first steps that they master when they do domain-driven design. It feels like, well, I'm not sure what goes here or whatever. I should know that. The DDD is stupid. It's actually one of the hardest. Aggregate design is really, really hard, and I think even the pros admit that there are no really great hard and fast rules for getting it right.
So that's more if you want to get into philosophy, talk about aggregates, like we did. We have two more terms really quickly. I'm going to actually try to define this as a DDD newbie, this term here, factories. So here's my definition of factories. Factories are objects that poop out other objects. How accurate is that?
What's with the poop theme today?
It's always about poop with me. I don't know why.
I think, if I remember the terminology correctly, I believe factories are made for creating new objects, whereas other things' purpose might be to get objects that already exist. So, like, get an object out of persistence, make it, take that data out of your database or whatever, and then get it into a domain entity. A factory is something that will make a new object that is not yet saved anywhere. So, like, I want to make a new sale factory, make me new sale object or something.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's also a good point here, real quick, by the way, that factory, the term, comes not from DDD, but from Gang of Four. It's one of the classic original design patterns here. So this is also a really interesting thing that we see in PHP a lot, where people look at DDD because it's new forms of OOP that they're not used to, and they assume it's a DDD thing, but actually a lot of it is just better OOP.
Again, I think that factories are overused. Basically, if things don't come into existence out of nothing, which is maybe why we have factories, but there's often better places for them to come from. If now I will be trying to find an example again, but if you have, I don't know, maybe you have a new employee, you hire this employee, you don't, this doesn't roll off a factory somewhere in the real world either. So maybe it's, I don't know, this is a crappy example. HR department hires employee. Ross, you have something better in mind?
Well, I was going to say that if you think employees don't roll off of factory lines, clearly you don't have an MBA.
But so the idea is that you try to give this responsibility for creating new objects to other objects, objects that know more about it. One aggregate could create a new, maybe the customer object is responsible for creating the invoice objects because that's where they come, or maybe it's the salesperson who creates the invoice object, or there's often some kind of relation between objects. You don't want some anonymous factory sitting somewhere and pooping out these objects to stick to your
sticking to the official terminology. Yeah. I'm expecting to have this terminology implemented to the next DDD book that gets written. And last term before we move on to hexagonal architecture is repositories, and we just actually had an open source talk in our last episode, and we talked about repositories. Is that the same thing?
So just because I talked about factories, I think repositories are the thing where you get models from persistence. So a repository might be like, get some objects that were created yesterday or something. Whereas a factory, again, is something where like I need to make a new object now, and then that'll get saved to persistence a few steps from now.
So persistence
and all this is,
I'm
saying like stuff like not in a domain-driven design fashion, obviously, because I'm talking about like database persistence. But from a domain-driven design point of view, repositories are like a thing where you get objects. And I think like their purpose is kind of to be treated as if all of your objects just exist in memory, and there is no like persistence layer. It's just like a thing to make it act, or make like a simple API within your code that says like, yeah, I have everything you could possibly want in here. Just tell me what you want, and I'll get it.
Sweet. So this seems like it's the most of all the terms so far. That seems the one to me. It seems the one that makes the most sense. It's just a repository. You get stuff.
I could just be oversimplifying. Is the other possibility.
Well, I like oversimplification. That was Einstein's idea behind theories. In general, if you can't explain your theory, then it's probably wrong. So I'm sure that applies for a lot of things.
I'm happy to make it more complex for you if you like.
Oh no! Well, I'd love for you to, but I think just because of time, we probably need to move on to just getting hexagonal architecture wrapped up here, because we, as Nicholas pointed out on Twitter, that we're talking about these layers, like application and domain layer. And hexagonal architecture kind of is all about layers. So what is, Chris, what is hexagonal architecture and why is it useful?
So it is an explanation of kind of like our best practices of stuff. I don't see it as like a it's nothing different. So like all the reading you've done of like how to structure code, not even a domain-driven design point of view, but just like code structure. It's kind of like I see it as like an explanation of wrapping all of these concepts together. So it has layers, right? So well, first of all, the number of sides of this hexagon does not matter. You can think of a side of an outer side of a hexagon as just like an entry point into your application. So like one side might be like your HTTP web or your HTTP API or your command line console or whatever else talks to your application from the outside. And then you get layers, right? So you have the outside layer, which is just like stuff talking to your application from externally somewhere. And then typically you have some code that has to transfer that to something like in an inner layer. So you have a framework like Symfony or Laravel or something that takes HTTP requests and commonly command line requests and passes those into like a controller or something. And that's a layer right there. That's something converting this protocol HTTP with information and headers and all this stuff in it and converting it into something that your code can use. So like a request to a URI endpoint that's a GET request goes to this method in this controller, and the framework is kind of built to do that. So you have like this outer layer that has the stuff to convert that request into something your code uses. And then inside of that, you have this other layer that converts this like this stuff that's not part of your application. So, in the nested deep inside of a hexagonal architecture system, the inner layer is like your domain-driven design code or, your code that describes your business problem. And the job of each layer is to convert stuff that's usable for the next layer inside of it. So HTTP request on the outside goes inside your framework layer. So your framework layer might be the one that converts an HTTP request into something your code uses. And then inside of that inside of that framework layer, you start speaking to your domain code. So you might have something like a command bus with commands. Your domain might define what those commands are. And the framework will, probably inside of a controller or something like that, will make a request on your application code through whatever interface your application code defines, like a command. So if I have a command, create new user or register a user or whatever you name it, based on a domain-driven philosophy, your framework might create a new command, add in the input, the stuff, just like in a command bus, the command portion, and then send that through to some, application service like the command bus handler that will run operations, based on whatever that command is. So create new user command to get run through, and then you have a handler that creates a new user, and that's calling on all of your domain-driven design code or your, whatever you have code on the inside of this layer. And there's more to it, but like this is just like how to think about your code in layers. And the hexagonal architecture is kind of like a good description of doing that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that hexagonal architecture and DDD are not concepts that grew up together or anything like that. They're not tightly coupled in any way. But people seem to confuse DDD and hexagonal architecture, thinking that they are directly related somehow. What would you say is the main kind of confusion points that people struggle with when they're trying to learn DDD and then they're learning hexagonal architecture at the same time and they're trying to like jam these concepts together?
That might be. So I think it's just like a confluence of things because people were talking about them at the same time. And not just in PHP, but in the Ruby world, I've noticed that. Or I think even, like, I looked into it because of a talk Uncle Bob did at a Ruby conference. So, like, even then, like, some stuff was going on in Ruby. But it was just all coming together at the same time, at least from my point of view. So I think
actually,
about them together. What's that?
I think actually von Vernen's book has a chapter on hexagonal. And I think that's the source of the confusion. So
That's true.
Alistair Coburn wrote the article about it, but it wasn't very well known. And because von Vernen included it in his book about implementing domain-driven design, people associate the two concepts together, which is fine, of course. But I think that's the source of the confusion.
Right. Yeah.
That's this whole hopefully this podcast doesn't actually can make it even more confusing because we're talking about it together as well. But I think that it's just important that we're kind of distinguishing that, yes, they are two different concepts. But before we wrap up, we're kind of running out of time. But Chris, can you give us a couple of quick examples of how DDD and hexagonal architecture specifically play well together?
Yeah, I believe so. Okay, so let's pretend you have a controller, and that controller is it's responsible for making a transaction, or maybe that's a bad word. I really mean as in like a monetary transaction, like you're buying something. Let's buy a guitar. So you might have like something in your domain-driven design portion of your app, your domain layer, your inner layer, that has like a use case defined for purchasing a guitar or purchasing whatever. So kind of encapsulated in this inner layer is all the code that goes along with that. So what's going to happen when someone purchases a guitar? Besides the credit card transaction portion, there's like the user, the amount of money going to your system, any events that get fired as a result of that, which is great. So you have like inside of your domain layer that code that handles that. Outside of this layer is something calling your code to do that. So like your controller and your framework might call a use case or a form class or a command in like the command bus kind of structure. And that command just gets sent to your application code to handle. So, I mean, I don't know about like specific use cases with domain-driven design that it works with. It's just useful to think about the different layers of your system and how they interact with each other, and also how you decouple them. So a big portion of this is decoupling your code between layers. So your domain layer, whether that's a domain-driven design application code or it's just active record models with some logic on them, that layer is decoupled from like application service layers, which is the stuff like the command bus or a class describing that user submitted a form and has to do validation and just send like post request data into something that can handle it. And each of these layers can do things like define interfaces that the outer layers need to use, it's just, which we don't have time to really get into, but the decoupling between these layers is really, I think, what's important to talk about here, rather than like how it works well with domain-driven design.
In a simple blog app, how many layers would you typically run into when you're designing it with DDD and hexagonal architecture?
So there's always the outside layer of things that call to your application. People on web clients or making curl requests or whatever. A framework layer, whether you're like a no framework person or not, you have something that interprets HTTP requests, command line requests, and converts it to code, or converts it to even what class method you're going to use to handle that request. So your outside layer, your framework layer, and then the inside layer, I kind of like to mix to add two layers there, like your application service layer, which are things like a command bus, a event dispatcher, the nitty-gritty of what actually sends an event out. And then inside of that, your domain code, which has all the business logic, your constraints, saying you can only save 2 users, 3 users is too many because that's what my business rules are.
Cool. Well,
so do we still have time?
Just a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Because this is sort of what I don't know if you can see this. What most people talk about. It's about the layers inside this hexagon. For me, the analogy starts to work way better if we start to think about the boundaries between systems. So this is, for me, I think this is more like the reason why it's hexagon, because you can fit pieces together, and if you start thinking about if you're building a complex system, then you don't want to have one big monolith. You want to have smaller systems working together, and that's where, as an analogy, hexagons work really well for me. The layers, of course, it's important, but that's in the end, that's internal to these smaller systems. In the same way that domain-driven design, we talked mostly about the tactical part, but the really interesting part is about how systems talk to each other and how boundaries work and how you have different contexts. And I just wanted to add this to to the discussion maybe. But
Yeah,
again,
you
it's
have multiple
maybe,
hexagons, right? So I guess
yeah,
even like
that's the
a
point.
hexagon could be like a bounded context, sort of like maybe like your authentication or authorization system is one hexagon, and your other stuff that does something more important to the domain is in another. And how they communicate, you can kind of abstract out using either like a HTTP API or just something in code. Like you have a way to transform a request into like a DTO type object that goes to your other context, and then that context will handle it and deal with it in another way, either creating entities out of it or whatever it needs to do to perform its operations.
This is good stuff, guys. We're kind of running out of time, so I'm actually going to wrap it up. But if you're watching live, I'm going to be posting the link to this Hangout, so you guys can join us for a post-show discussion and a little. Sometimes it gets a little rowdy, but and for those who are joining us at the table, that you're welcome to stick around. No pressure to stick around. It's just kind of like see where it goes, kind of thing. But I do have a topic of discussion. So if you're watching live, here's the topic for the post-show discussion. Some people get their super fanboy craziness about like a particular framework like Laravel or Symfony. So these web frameworks are architected in a very particular way, which works really well for a web framework. So I get the sense a lot that people learn their design styles and principles from the way that these frameworks are architected, and it's not particularly the best way to architect a general project. So I was going to see if you're watching live, if you've seen this, or if you learned from a framework and then you started realizing, wait a minute, just because a web framework it works well for a web framework doesn't mean it works well for my project. We'd love to hear some feedback, or if you just have some general thoughts on DDD and stuff that we've discussed, certainly join us for the discussion. In just a second, I'll be posting that on Twitter. So I want to wrap this up with a developer shout-out, which is a new little segment that recognizes a developer that has contributed a lot to the PHP community or to the open source world, and gives them basically a big shout-out, a thank you for their contributions. So the developer is nominated by the panel before the show, and for this episode, I asked the panel to nominate someone who has contributed a lot to the understanding of DDD and the PHP community, which happens to be most of the people on this panel. So I was going to maybe randomly select one to give a token of appreciation, which is a $25 Amazon gift card here. But they actually nominated the Broadway team. And I asked Matthias if he could explain why the Broadway team. What is the Broadway team, and why are they being nominated for the developer shout-out for the DDD discussion?
Well, it's a couple of guys who work for a company called Candidate, and they have built an open source event sourcing library or framework. Event sourcing is one of the things in domain-driven design we didn't discuss in detail, but it's a way to actually build event-based models. And the stuff they're building is really nice. It's easy to understand. They have posted an example application as well. I think they're doing great stuff, and they really deserve it.
That's awesome. So they are well deserving of this $25 gift card. So you guys will be hearing from me soon to see how I can get this to you guys. And this gift card was sponsored by my own company, Sammy K Media. Woohoo! But if you're interested in sponsoring the developer shout-out segment, just like my company did, Sammy K Media did today, with a gift card or some other thing that your company has offered, definitely hit me up on Twitter at PHP Roundtable, and I'll definitely give you credit on the show for sponsoring this segment, and plus you get super awesome high fives and kudos for helping recognize awesome people in the PHP community. So, in closing, are there any final thoughts from Chris, Ross, or Matthias?
Keep experimenting with your models.
Yeah, you gotta. I think something we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast was how this isn't applicable to all situations, but at the same time you need to learn it. So on like side projects or something, you really should experiment with this stuff, even if you can't come up with a domain model that's rich enough to like fully express and use like all these domain-driven design concepts.
Nice.
Have fun. You can do it.
You can do it. Keep hard. Keep persistence, because it's going to be hard to take on, but you'll get it. That's good advice. So next episode actually is coming up, I guess, next week. I have to define officially the time and all that stuff and a couple more guests, but it's all about security in PHP with Daniel Lowry and Anthony Ferrara, and it should be really fun. I'm looking forward to this security talk. Lots of nasty hacks went on in 2014, so it'd be good to discuss some of that stuff. if you have something you'd like to share about a topic that PHP nerds care about, you need to be on this panel. So hit me up on Twitter if you're interested. My Twitter handle is SammyK, or just ping PHP Roundtable. I'd like to thank Chris, Ross, and Matthias for joining us for this discussion, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. All right, so if you're still watching live, that was the iTunes version. Now we're going to get the raw version, the after party. I'm going to post a link so you guys can join us in the Hangout, and we can discuss that framework thing I was talking about earlier, or just more DDD stuff. So here it is, going live at PHP Roundtable. That's the Twitter handle that just posted that. And thank you guys for coming on the show. You guys were awesome. I learned so much about DDD. My mind's exploding a little bit. And you guys don't have, there's no pressure for you guys to stick around. I know some of you guys had some engagements afterwards, but you know, we'll see if anybody wants to join us for the discussion, post-party discussion. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Sometimes it gets crazy.
Cool.
I think we have our first.
Our first one.
I'm going to be right back.
All right. Is it Jermaine?
It's silence.
Silence. Might be finding a microphone. Scrambling for a mic. I'm going to scroll back up to my notes here so I can get these post-show discussions going on. So if you missed it, the post-show discussion topic was about this idea of a particular web framework like Laravel or Symfony, and the way that they're coded, they get a lot of celebration for, like, oh, it's coded so well for a web framework, and it works really great for a web framework. But what about for a specific project, like just general design principles? What do you guys think? Do you think that there's things that work really well for a web framework that don't work well at all for just anything else?
I suppose as a framework, also you're sort of in a different mode and a different way of thinking. You're trying to come up with generic solutions to generic problems that everybody has. When you're building an application, you're trying to come up with specific solutions. And because we learn a lot from watching or from looking at code and ideas and things written in frameworks, but that doesn't mean we have to write code in the same way and the same style. Like one of the typical, I would say, anti-patterns is people structuring their folders, all the controllers together and all the repositories together, all the entities together. That doesn't really make sense, especially not from a domain-driven design point of view. You want, the invoice and the invoice repository and the invoice line items and maybe the commands for that invoice and the events of that invoice. You want these things to be together because they logically belong together.
Yeah, I like to see a framework as helping you with like all the cruft of stuff that's not important to your domain, like services, like validation, notification, like sending emails or SMS or something, and of course, importantly, accepting requests from somewhere, HTTP, RPC APIs, webhooks, which just another HTTP method, but because we're talking web frameworks for the most part. So they help you, but how you write your code for your domain is up to you, really. And of course, all these frameworks are designed for HTTP and stuff. So if we're building like a mobile application, that's a little different because the actions taken on your application are through like gestures and physical events. And of course, one kind of interesting thing are things like Ionic framework and that kind of stuff that use like JavaScript and typical web languages to program like applications. But I don't really have enough experience in them to talk about, if that becomes really problematic.
Well, actually, we just got a new guest, Frank, and looks like Andrew's back. He's joined us before. Welcome, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hey, guys.
Hey. Was that Frank or Andrew that just said something?
It was Andrew.
Andrew, hey. Frank, I think your volume is really low. Are you able to crank that up a little?
Let me see.
You're like far, far away.
Mm-hmm.
Did
Is
you?
better?
Oh, there we go. Nice.
All right.
Welcome. Where are you calling
Thank
in
you.
from?
I'm from Holland.
Oh, welcome. That's you're in the same land as Ross right now.
Yeah, indeed.
That's awesome. And Andrew, where are you coming in from?
From Scotland.
Oh, cool. We only have so it's just me and Chris representing the U.S. over here.
Yeah. Minority.
So, do
kinda
you guys
funny,
have any
actually,
thoughts on the
because-
framework?
sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Ross. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's kind of funny actually. I was at ZenCon back in October, and I feel like at least here in especially the Benelux area, like there's a lot of DDD stuff flying around. It's spreading to the UK. It's really getting big in Europe, but the revolution hasn't quite started in the US yet. Like I was talking to Steve Rhodes, and he was saying that he's been pushing it for years there, and it's an uphill battle at least within PHP, but maybe it'll catch on one of these days.
Hopefully, the PHP Roundtable have played a pivotal role in making it a big thing in the U.S. Right?
This is the day.
How
Well,
about
I do think the Laravel community has been talking about it, and
yes?
they had some talks at Laracon US that at least touched on the topic, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Like I think Sean McCool has played a really, really pivotal role in like pushing for that. Like he's a friend of ours actually, and he's a really great guy, and he's been really promoting that and pushing that, which is
But
awesome.
I count him as a European. He lives in the Netherlands, so
Claim him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was going to be on the show, but he ran into something and he couldn't last minute, unfortunately. But yeah, he was going to add his 2 cents on everything, which is cool. Hey, Frank and Andrew, do you guys have any thoughts on this, on any of the discussion that we had, or the topic, the post-show discussion topic of how web frameworks are architected versus just general applications?
Well, I haven't. When I watched this discussion, I noticed that I actually have not a real a grasp of DDD as I thought I had. I'm a Laravel developer, and I'm using the Commander package by Jeffrey Way on Laracasts. And so I was thinking, all right, I'm using commands, I'm using basic domain-driven structuring my code, like I'm using repositories with all kinds of descriptive methods and everything to really mirror the language of the client. But when I'm hearing all these kind of terms of service layers and hexagonal design and architecture, I'm really thinking I barely scratched the surface.
Yes.
there's always more to learn.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely found it.
My trick is oh, sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
No, on you go.
Well, I was just going to say that my secret trick is to go to non-PHP conferences, and then I hear all the stuff I don't know anything about, and then I talk about it in the PHP community, and then people
smart.
oh, I never heard of this stuff. Well, yeah, I stole it from elsewhere.
That's smart.
I've felt that I just don't think I'd ever be able to stop learning it. There's just so much material out there, and some of it's actually quite hard to find. And then there's conflicting versions of things as it's evolved to find it. It's really quite difficult. It's like what Matthias was saying earlier about factory pattern being overused. And I'm so bad for that. And he explained it really well as well about how maybe a customer is responsible for creating an invoice, and so maybe you don't need an invoice factory. And I'm sitting looking at like a factory right now that I'm like, yeah, I don't think I need this. This is just ridiculous. And it just makes it so clear. But it's only until you're in these sort of situations that you realise, maybe I'm misunderstanding. This anonymous factory doesn't really need to exist.
One of the problems, of course, is that all the code you can find on GitHub, it's always libraries and frameworks, but it's never domain models, because usually that's the stuff that is covered by NDAs, and that has the competitive advantage for the companies, and it's not the stuff that you publish. So all the examples that we get are very technical and not very domain centric.
It's really frustrating. It's like anytime you want to have a DDD discussion with somebody based on something you find online, it's like be prepared to hear about shipping. It's always shipping. There's always something else actually. But I think there's a turning point anyways at which we need to all sort of like agree on a domain and put our cards on the table, like with OpenCFP or something like that. That would be like a really interesting place, I think, to sort of try and bring it to bear and build an actual application people are interested in, because right now, folks are picking it up from conversations like ours, which obviously can only scratch the surface. They're trying to pick it up from books that teach top-down and maybe don't come from the developer's perspective, or they're trying to learn it from folks who maybe don't have a good grasp on it themselves or figure it out as they go. And I think honestly, like, I've seen some examples recently with working on a command bus package, for example, where there's some really confused stuff going on out there. And I think that we have to find a better way to teach this.
But the sample application is hard because it's still only code. You don't get conversations with the clients. You don't get the problem-solving process. You don't get the design thinking. You only get the artifact. And what makes it even harder is that domain-driven design, as we mentioned, suits complex problems. If you have a sample app that is 50,000 lines of code, nobody's going to read that code. So you'd have to have something very simple. And if it's simple, there's not really a point to doing domain-driven. You get to-do apps, but if you have a to-do app with DDD patterns, it just doesn't make sense. It's just over-designed. It's just noise.
That's a really good point. Is that even if you open source a project, that's domain-driven design project, you're only getting one tiny piece of the whole thing that application represents. And so when you look at a bank application that treats a dollar as an entity, you think, oh, dollars need to be treated as entities in my project, whereas really your dollar probably needs to be treated as a value object. And so there's going to be a really tough thing learning from an open source project when you don't have both sides of that feedback loop. But actually, say hi to Daniel, Craig, and it looks like Powell. They joined us today, just now. Welcome, guys. They're muted right now. You can unmute and say hi.
Real quick, by the way, that we have to open source the video conversations too.
Yes, absolutely. Are you guys able to unmute your mic? Daniel, Craig, you popped in a little earlier. Okay, maybe they'll chime in later. Maybe a little
the hardest thing. There's never an app that just works for everyone.
Yeah, I know. Well, so I actually tried to code the Facebook SDK. I've been contributing a lot to the PHP SDK, and tried to push it towards a domain-driven model. And I'm not, since I've been learning it, I don't think I did it right. No, I feel like I did. I implemented a lot of entities, value objects, or mainly just entities, factories, and service layers. But some of these other concepts I don't think I touched much on, and I probably could have gotten some more succinct code, maybe better decoupled code out of it. But I'm almost kind of hoping that an expert in DDD, I'm not calling out you guys, but I'm just saying like anybody who's watching or knows somebody who's wanting to get involved in open source and our DDD expert to kind of look at the PHP SDK for Facebook. It's not the one on the default branch when you go to GitHub. It's actually, you have to change the branch to master, and it's the master branch. It hasn't been released yet. It's 4.1. But anyway, it's organized. We had like an entities folder, and we started like just putting everything in there because pretty much everything was an entity. And then we're like, why are we doing this? So we just refactoring quite a bit. I thought what I've been calling a super service layer is the one called Facebook. It's Facebook.php. It basically ties all of the services together, all of everything that does. Is it correct to call it like a big super, your main super class that gives the developer a nice API to use? Is that a service?
It sounds like a god class. No, I don't know. Yeah. Maybe it's all right. Maybe it's just like a facade or something that presents an easier interface. I don't know anything about Facebook and the API and how it works. So maybe what you need is not a DDD expert, but a domain expert, somebody who knows Facebook really well and have conversations with them and learn how they talk and think and like a ubiquitous language is not just. It's not just words. It's not just a glossary of words. It's idioms. Like, would you say it like this? When this happens, you do this kind of thing. That's the sort of questions you ask. You try to really understand the things that people in the domain would actually say in a certain way. Maybe with Facebook and an SDK, it's just a technical problem, and it's not. I don't know. Maybe it's very suitable for domain design. I don't know anything about it, so I should shut up.
I think it's a really good, interesting case though, because it seems like when it comes to remote API design, we take everything that we know about API design and then we chuck it out the window and pretend it's a big HTTP database. You know, so I think it'll be cool to see people pay more attention to that as we go.
True that. I think Laravel kind of pushed that for me as like a pretty API is. Like when I start to write a piece of code, I actually start with the API now. Inspired by the way that Taylor Otwell talks about how he designs his stuff, and it's really nice to launch an open source project when you've worked on the API first, and then you're like, this is beautiful, guys. Just check this out how it works. It's just nice. But hey, Frank, you said you use when you're coding in a Laravel application, you're using a lot of the same terminology and stuff as Laravel. Do you find that where are you putting all of your main logic when you're writing a Laravel application?
In our application folder, we have a folder named that has the name of the client, and in that folder we separate all the different functionalities of the system. Like for example, we have a project where you can have a subscription for weekly bytes like nuts or chocolate or everything. So we've got folders like subscription and bytes, and that's why I asked that question on Twitter, how you would deal with name changes, because when we first started creating the application, we named everything products, but the term the client uses were bytes. So during the development, we've tried to implement domain-driven design, and then we chose to rename everything that was once product to their own terminology, byte. And so we didn't need what Russ recommended. We did a very big refactor.
Well, yeah, in a big application that could be kind of a pain, right? Even if you have PHP Storm or something to refactor it real fast for you, it's still a big breaking change.
Yeah, it is, and there's still methods in the system that use products, but we do like Russ, we just have a big comment saying this is a byte now.
And maybe it doesn't matter if it's code that nobody will ever touch again, and it just works and it sits there. Then don't worry about it. That's part of strategic DDD is deciding what code is really important and what code should really be iterated over and improved over time. And if it's just something that works and that the business doesn't really care about, then neither should you as a developer.
No. Okay. Yeah.
That's an interesting side effect too, by the way, of like really splitting this stuff out and using bounded context. Like you were asking earlier, like how many layers would you have in a blog context, for example? I would say one, WordPress or Drupal. It's like if I've got my system properly insulated or whatever, then I can build custom solutions for the parts I actually care about, and then I can toss the rest off the prepackaged stuff that I don't. But I think that's a really nice benefit of isolation at a large scale.
So you're talking about basically this idea of a layered onion, and you have an onion called WordPress, and instead of adding more layers to the inside of that onion, you just create another onion with your application, and then you connect them. But the onion is actually hexagonally shaped so that they connect better, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
He said yes with a question mark.
If you really want to get through to Ross, just add some poop into your story and he'll understand.
Chris,
I actually got to take off because I'm in the middle of the workday still.
Oh, yeah. Thanks so much for joining us, Chris.
Sure. Thank you all. It's a fun
You're
time.
beast.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Talk to you soon, man. Bye.
Bye.
Well, Andrew, we haven't heard from you, man. What's going on with you in DDD? Are you coding in DDD right now?
I am. Well, I'm not really strict, and I'm still learning. Like less than a year, I've been practicing DDD. I'm in the middle of two projects. Kind of maybe got a question about one actually. I have one that's it's a RESTful API, and I have one that's just like a greenfield project that I'm using as my main source of learning. I've found that sometimes the concept of REST API and DDD doesn't quite go together, because I feel like I'm manipulating a resource as a REST API, and I'm trying to expose I'm obviously not trying to expose my database schema or anything like this, but then exactly when the request comes in to update a property, exactly what do I do? Do I create a command for each one of these things, or do I create a simple command? So say you guys maybe had a simple resource exposed, such as maybe page, and you had to update your content. Would you create like a command to handle just that single update page content? I mean, as I say, I feel like this is obviously a command, but like it's part of the ubiquitous language. But like, what about every little tiny property? Do you create a command for each one?
No, I would find stuff that changes together, and if you approach this as a CRUD thing, then it's hard to see these kinds of things. But if you approach this from the domain, and okay, what are you trying to do? Maybe you're not changing the address, but maybe you're relocating, or maybe you're just I don't know, fixing a typo. In some domains, this doesn't matter. It's just the same thing. It's just update address. But in some domains, this can really make a difference. For example, I worked for a client that does credit control, and so they're chasing people who haven't paid their bills. If somebody changes the address because of a typo, that has little effect to the rest of the system. If somebody changes their address because they relocate, maybe if they relocate a couple of times, it means they're trying to avoid paying their bills, or they're trying to cheat in some way. Or so you try to, if you understand the domain, then some of these things are really not as granular as changing a field. It's either this command represents the intention of the user. That's what you're trying to capture. And if you want to marry this to REST API, well, first of all, not everything has to be REST API. There's other ways of doing HTTP or doing communication between systems. But even within REST, it actually works very well if you adapt your definition of what a resource is. If you read the original paper about REST by I forgot his name. Yes, exactly. So a resource can be anything. It can be a thing. It can be a message. It can even be code. So, for example, this command. A command is a message. It's you or the user expressing his intention to the system by sending a message saying, "I want this to be done." This message is the resource. It's not the thing that you're manipulating. It's the message is the resource. So instead of saying, I'm manipulating the customer resource and changing a field, you could say my intention is to relocate this customer, so I'm sending a relocate customer command. This message is the resource. I post it to some endpoint, and what happens after that, I don't care about it. So you're decoupling the implementation of your properties and your entities and all these things from your REST API, if that makes sense.
And this was what I was talking about earlier, actually, exactly this, when I was saying that when it comes to HTTP APIs, that we just sort of we take what we know and sort of throw it out the window. That we have this idea that, when it comes to RESTful APIs, that they should be CRUD. But if I were to point you to a web app like, say, Twitter or an accounting software or something like that, I mean, none of that stuff is presented with CRUD interfaces anymore. I mean, those are like really slick applications. They have good pages. They have task-based UIs. They have good design, right? All that stuff still runs on HTTP. I mean, so we don't think about that as a CRUD-based app anymore. And so you should be able to do the exact same thing with your REST APIs, that you should make it not necessarily command focused, actually, because it's almost an implementation detail inside of your app, but you should make it intent focused. You should make it have a user flow, just like you do when you're designing the website. Like you actually design, people would go to follow this process in order to get this thing done. You should do that exact same type of thing for your REST API, and then you can do that with Git and Post and things like that, just like you do with a website. And some of this touches on the idea of, hypermedia APIs, but you can design, just like you would design a website, you can design a REST API that way. And whether it's using commands internally or anything like that, nobody cares. I mean, it's just a difference between what you present to the user and how you present it. So if I were to give you a JSON schema and say that your message has to fit to this JSON schema or this XML schema, that's the exact same if I were to present you with an HTML form. An HTML form is just a schema for humans for formatting HTTP messages. So that's a little bit like, I know, new agey REST hypermedia, but I feel like this idea about how does DDD and REST tie together, well, it's the exact same way that DDD and your web interface in your browser tie together. It should be that exact same methodology.
Yeah, it really helps, guys. I've been looking a lot about RPC and how other things can do. I've been reading a lot about the Richardson maturity model as well, and how I'm going to mature our API. That's maybe the best way of wording it. But dealing with a lot of legacy, so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
But thanks for the feedback, guys. Sorry, on you go, Ross.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say RPC is it's not inherently evil, and there's nothing wrong with it, especially if you only have one single internal consumer. I think when you have more external consumers for an API, then you definitely want to maybe invest in something that's more evolvable, like a REST setup. But if you just have one internal like entry point, who cares?
Cool. Well, thanks very much. It helps a lot. It feels like I was on the right tracks. Do you know what I mean? So it's quite validating.
Actually, we have Paul in who's got his mic all muted, so he can't talk, but he's been chatting, but he has a question for you guys. He says, as for me, a guy who just started to learn all this stuff, the most difficult thing is to get a grip on all the DDD philosophy. I got used to a very simple MVC pattern where I packed tons of rules and logic inside the models, using Laravel, by the way. But sooner or later, my models and whole application tend to reflect a database schema, not business problem the application has to solve. That's nice to listen to all of you guys, but after all, when getting back to work, I just can't change my habits. Any hints on how to make that first step and change the way of thinking?
Well, what really works for me is to just build a domain model without thinking about databases at all. And it's hard to turn off because we've been, building CRUD and building systems on top of a relational database most of our careers. Sometimes it's even easier to teach a beginning developer, a junior developer, domain-driven design because they have no baggage that they take with them. So try to forget everything. Try to design or build a bit of code. Not too much. I mean, we don't want to have like a waterfall all over again. Domain-driven design does come from the same kind of ideas as Agile. It originated in the same period. So model something on the whiteboard, try to build some code for it, then try to build the code to make it work in the database. And you might have to make some adjustments to your model code, but that's okay. We're not trying to build theoretical models. We're trying to build models that actually work in reality. Maybe in some cases it will be good enough. Some problems don't need a lot of DDD or a great model. Try to identify the important things, the things that give your company a competitive advantage, and focus on those. Try to evolve those. I think Ross said it earlier that the code that is making money should be the best code in your system.
I would also if Sean McCool were here, because he's sort of the Laravel DDD go-to guy there. Sean McCool would probably say that this is active record thinking. That Eloquent is like leading you down a slippery slope, so to speak. So what Matthijs is advocating here in terms of build it completely decoupled from the database and then later on port it, that may come across a little bit unnaturally with how you're used to working with Laravel perhaps, but I do think it's achievable. And also it's like some folks would say, well, switch to Doctrine because that will give you a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you do that. I've noticed that if I build something completely standalone and then port it to the database afterwards, I get a very, very different result than if I start thinking database first. And then often, just a slightly different approach here, is that if you collaborate with other developers, I've noticed that 90% of the developers I work with, if you ask them sit down and design an application, 90% of them will start off with a database diagram, 5% of them will start off with a UML diagram, and 5% of them will start off with a web UI flow. And then there's a couple guys, 0.1%, who do user stories. And those are the correct 1.1%. But in the meantime, maybe try a UML diagram. Crazy thought.
Cool. Good advice. And there's actually Daniel Craig in here too, who doesn't have a mic, but he actually chatted here to touch on an earlier point. I know a few of the larger management consulting companies that are advocating DDD to surface and demonstrate issues with their client companies. So, so that's what we were talking about earlier, about that feedback loop. That kind of, as you start to try to, figure out what these companies call these things, and make your code name the same things, and then you uncover these problems that the company didn't even know they had. What kind of issues do you guys find are kind of frequently pop up, or pop up in a that you've seen that pop up that you're just kind of really surprised at, like, whoa, I didn't expect to find that issue. Has anybody run into anything like that, where they're just domain-driven design just uncovered something cool or bad, I should say?
Well, I already mentioned about optimizing the walking distances. When I say it like that, it makes a lot of sense. But when I arrived at this company and we started, modeling problems, we were talking about all the typical warehousing stuff with, shipments come in, and you need to store them somewhere, and you need to keep track of where they're stored, and you need to, pick the orders and get them out, and there's a lot of complexity in there. But then we started digging deeper and deeper, and basically what emerged from that was this whole idea that so they want to build a completely new version of their system, and basically we decided after 4 days that we wouldn't. The traditional approach would be to start with, okay, so we have shipments and we have boxes and we have storage space, etc. The way we're going to build it now is actually we have order pickers and walking distances and walking times from point A to B, and build all of this first, or build a model for this first, and then fill in the blanks. So domain-driven design has helped us to approach our model from a completely different angle. If you were to build it, and this is what people usually run into, they start building all the basics, the shipments and the boxes and the things, and then the business rules are added later, and then it turns out that it's very hard to implement these business rules with the structure that they built, and then they need to refactor or they need to hack it somehow. If you start with this center, with this most important stuff, and then you build all the stuff around it, then you're sure at every point when you add stuff that you can still keep this core domain intact and working smoothly. I actually have another example of how DDD helped us on an education project where, well, they had a lot of legacy, and they basically dug themselves into a mess, and one of the things was that they needed report cards for the kids. And I said, okay, can you show me how this works? And he says, well, we don't have them yet, because before we had report cards, we needed tests, and we needed pupils and parents and teachers and class groups, and they had built all this structural stuff. They had tables and they had active records for all of this, but they still didn't have reports at all. So there was still no value from the point of view of the client. This is not even domain-driven design. This is agile. Start with the thing that gives you value, even if it's just a little bit. So we didn't start over, but we started at the end. We said, okay, now we have a report card. It's just a blank sheet. What is the most important thing we can add to this? So we build our model on top of this report card, instead of having this report card as an artifact at the end of our model.
Hey, I totally forgot to do shameless plugs for you guys at the end. I'm so sorry. You know what? I want to do that right now if we can, and I'm going to edit it into the iTunes version.
We're shameless enough.
No. It's in case you have, like, because I know I wanted to get Chris to promote, like, servers for hackers and stuff like that, and he's got, like, a book and stuff like that. So, can I just have you? Let's just, for the next just minute or two, just act like we're broadcasting live, and then or we are broadcasting live, but act like the iTunes version, so I can edit this in later. Is that cool?
Sure.
All right, cool. All right, so let me actually move on to my show notes here. So Matthias, do you have anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Well, I have the DDD Belgium meetup group. We come together once a month, and we have interesting people. Like tomorrow we have Rinat Abdulin, who's a big guy in DDD. And I also teach domain-driven design workshops. I have one coming up in Belgium, and I'll hope to do some more this year, but I have no dates yet.
Cool. And Ross, I know you were you were like, no, I don't need to do shameless plug, but do you have any shameless plugs that you have?
Yeah, actually, a lot of them. Like Matthias, we also have a user group here in Utrecht in the Netherlands. It's called DOM Code, and it's cross-language, so you can come talk about anything and everything, and that's really taken off. We're really proud of it. I'm also working on a book that'll hopefully come out in Q1 of this year called Discovering Doctrine with DDD, and it's mostly about learning doctrine, learning to use it well, hopefully, but also a little bit of tactical DDD work. And then I've got a bunch of other side projects to announce later this year. One of them, by the way, is a command bus library called Tactician, which will hopefully be awesome, and you should all take a look at.
Nice. And Chris, do you have anything you would like to shamelessly plug? Well, yes, Servers for Hackers, my new book. No, I'll contact him later so that he can shamelessly plug an audio snippet, and I can edit it into the iTunes version. I just made a lot of editing work for myself later. Yay. I can't believe I skipped over that segment. I need to make that more prominent in my show notes for next time.
It's okay. I'll have to leave you guys now.
Yes, well, thank you so much for joining me, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join. I think it's actually I've got to actually pop out of here too. So Ross and Powell and Daniel Craig and Andrew and Matthias, thank you guys so much.
My pleasure.
Take
See you
care.
later.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Talk to you soon.
See you later,
Bye.
guys.
Bye.